If you look at the Bundeswehr from the outside as a military historian, it presents itself, apart from the trivial tradition directives, like the U.S. Army at the beginning of World War II in 1939. It was a rather provincially oriented and inadequately trained organization of around 190,000 men with automatic promotions and an all-powerful, overblown bureaucracy. So, almost identical to the Bundeswehr, which has adopted a lot from the Americans to this day. At that time, the U.S. Army had outdated command structures. It was led by officers who had been trained for a different kind of war. And there really wasn't a structure in place to conduct worldwide operations. However, over the course of the war, the U.S. Army was to grow to over 8 million men in a process that brought profound organizational, cultural, and logistical challenges. So all of that is something you can't expect from Minister Pistorius, who was appointed by the SPD, either. In order to quickly get this extraordinary challenge under control, on September 1, 1939, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed George Catlett Marshall as General and Chief of Staff of the Army. In any case, with the appointment of General Marshall, that came to an end. With any sensitivities, while in Germany, since the governments of Schröder, Merkel, and Scholz, defense policy has just been muddled through, always anxiously trying not to upset Gosputin Putin, nor the pacifist Greens, the leftists in the SPD, or the neo-communists, also known as the left. However, things have not improved under the successor government, which is boxed in by the firewall with Vice-Chancellor Klingbeil from the SPD, whom Chancellor Merz from the CDU obediently follows. Except that multi-billion sums have been made available for the military, and continue to be, but you never really know which military they're actually intended for. So, what is the current state of the combat readiness that was talked about for the Bundeswehr in 2023? In reality, it can be observed that not much has actually changed in terms of structure and organization up to now, except for the announcement of a voluntary conscription scheme that makes little logical sense. Neither is the Tank Brigade, currently in Lithuania, even remotely operational. And the Homeland Defense Division, consisting of 6 regiments, is, in terms of equipment and training, in a possible military conflict in the 21st century. An anachronism like no other. Added to this is the ever-growing bureaucracy that has been cultivated for decades, where automatic promotions are simply the rule. And due to the compulsive attachment to civil servant pay scales, an almost obscene inflation of ranks has set in, along with a simultaneous devaluation of those ranks. About this once proud and powerful army, with 38 combat brigades and 12 partially active Homeland Defense brigades, just to mention the Army, which has now become a miniature army. Reduced to 185,420 personnel, there are 1,078 soldiers and 1,846 civilian employees in the 2 official seats, Bonn and Berlin. Then, for years now, there have been the bloated, half-military, half-civilian offices, like the Federal Office for Personnel Management of the Bundeswehr, with brigade strength of more than 6,800 people, of whom probably 50% could be dismissed without anyone noticing. The Civilian Organizational Area for Procurement, Equipment, Information Technology, and Support, with 11,642 civil servants, and 1,933 soldiers, as well as the equally civilian organizational area for infrastructure, environmental protection and services, with 34,000 civil servants and employees, and 1,093 soldiers. The most impressive is the number of about 220 positions for generals and admirals, roughly 320 Leopard, 2 main battle tanks, which is a bit more than 1 for each general or admiral. So when you look at the armed forces of the Federal Republic of Germany, the so-called parliamentary army, the phrase immediately comes to mind, like master, like servant. Because the former conscientious objectors, who have been found in all important positions for decades, have done a thorough job. Not to mention the group of women who served as ministers from 2013 to 2023, and the inspector generals who echoed them at the time. What should one think of an army in which, for decades, the terms war and combat were avoided like the devil avoids holy water, and which, out of cowardice, still doesn't dare to overturn the foolish songbook decision made by Minister von der Leyen? The army, about which the SPD minister currently in charge, in typical Federal Republic fashion, reassuringly says that it must be able to fight in order not to have to fight. A statement as nonsensical as the demand. The fire department must be able to extinguish fires in order not to have to extinguish fires. Or the police dog must be able to bite in order not to have to bite. If he were really serious about being ready for war, or at least ready to fight, he or the Inspector General should have made it clear that if there has to be fighting, then it should damn well be won. But how is that supposed to work with an army that wants to be ready for war, but can't even march in step anymore? That in a worldwide, unique, almost pathological process, is desperately distancing itself both outwardly and inwardly from its predecessor army, about which the world-leading expert in the field, the Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld, said, "The Wehrmacht was a great fighting force, which in terms of morale, spirit, and internal cohesion was among the armies of the 20th century. No 20th century army had anything like it. Many armies around the world have copied their organization and principles, and in some cases even their uniforms, without the world coming to an end as a result. And the practice, going on for decades, of announcing necessary measures by political and military leaders, only for all of them to get shelved again, is unworthy of both the soldiers and the public. When will people in apparently clueless Berlin realize, in these increasingly turbulent times in Europe and the Middle East, that in a war you always have to assume the worst, both regarding the enemy and the supposed friend and ally, especially when you constantly insult and offend the president of the most powerful allied nation? Sometimes it seems to me that the civilian and military leadership of the army, which was founded in 1955 in Bonn on the Rhine and still has its main office in this city today, has internalized the third article of the Cologne Basic Law, which states as follows: "It has always worked out somehow, or in plain English, everything may be a mess, but it will turn out fine." Because according to the announcements and the orders worth an incredible number of billions, they want, believe it or not, to become Europe's strongest conventional army in 13 years. Although the Poles want that too. And France, which is closely aligned with them, will also have a say in Berlin's plans. And since the upper limit for German armed forces is set in the 2+4 treaty, all of this is only possible with sleight of hand. I guarantee you there will be some real surprises in the future that will show you the value of partners. I mentioned at the beginning the appointment of General Marshall as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army in 1939. Most people only know the name Marshall from the Marshall Plan, which was initiated by him as Secretary of State after the war. Financial aid to a total of 19 countries, with Austria receiving about 5% and West Germany about 10%. Right away, between $1.4 and $1.5 billion, although the Federal Republic was the only country that had to pay back about $1 billion of it by 1966. In any case, starting in 1939, Marshall coordinated all Allied operations in Europe and the Pacific in his powerful position, so successful that later, President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt after his death in April 1945, called Marshall the architect of victory in World War II. Because, considering the global situation at that time, the rise showed how an aging, complacent army was made combat-ready almost overnight, and not like in Germany. Fondly remembering the Echternach spring procession, where 3 steps forward and 2 steps back were taken. The first thing Marshall did was to get rid of all the yes-men found in every office, because he wanted men around him who would tell him the truth. After that, he focused on analyses about Germany and the Wehrmacht and their structure. And under the principle of seniority versus performance, he implemented the so-called meritocratic promotion policy in the U.S. Army. Time and again, he had exercises carried out down to division level by the general he appointed for the entire military training of the Army, Leslie James McNair, who was killed by friendly fire in Normandy in 1944 with full-strength units, followed by a tough evaluation of the performance at each level. The result was that he either transferred hundreds of incompetent officers up to the rank of general away from the troops or forced them to leave. There was no gradual, comfortable transition with the proverbial golden German handshake. There was a rigorous purge, with entire leadership levels of the Army being replaced by younger, though inexperienced officers like Eisenhower or Bradley, both of whom proved themselves. Marshall, a career soldier, recognized the tactical superiority of the Wehrmacht on almost all levels, and therefore saw it as by far the most dangerous and efficient opponent among the Axis powers. Therefore, he strongly advocated for the Germany First strategy, being fully aware that even the powerful United States could not defeat Germany on its own. But he had also more or less calculated that, in the long run, the superior logistical strength of the Allies, coordinated warfare in the south, west, and east, as well as a direct attack on Germany, would ultimately defeat the Wehrmacht. After the end of the war, he therefore explicitly emphasized the decisive British contribution as well as the destruction of the majority of the German army by the Red Army, which was massively supported by the Western Allies through the Lend-Lease program. When he took office, Marshall recognized that only rigorous training would enable them to stand up to the battle-hardened German troops. In this peacetime army, which existed until the Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, there was no quitting time on Friday afternoon. There were no overcrowded sick bays when a march was scheduled, and no grumbling about this or that. If someone didn't like being a non-commissioned officer or officer in the Army, or if, for example, an officer failed to set a good example through obscenities, they were dismissed, if necessary even dishonorably. Originally, Marshall had planned an army of 265 divisions in which the system of rotating units, as practiced by the British and other allies, was to be implemented. But under pressure from government and business representatives, the lobbyists who considered workers in industry and agriculture to be indispensable, he had to reduce his plan in 1943 to 90 divisions. Now, under the pressure of having more than 175 fewer Army divisions than needed, Marshall developed a training and transfer concept that had catastrophic consequences, one that any army should be warned against. Because together with the already mentioned General McNair, who was responsible for the reorganization and overall military training of the Army, the soldiers who had received basic training in massive training facilities were not sent to the divisions engaged in combat, at least by platoon or company, but individually. This constant reassignment of individual soldiers made it almost impossible for camaraderie and cohesion to develop, as well as the passing on of combat experience by more senior ranks. Then, after the Allied landing in Normandy in June 1944, these patched-together units encountered the exhausted but highly battle-hardened and still tenacious German divisions, who gave the inexperienced, often far too quickly trained pretty boys hardly any time to think. The individual replacement system broke down. For infantry divisions, it completely collapsed by the end of 1944. Now the insufficient number of divisions, especially among the infantry, also took its toll. The result was that soldiers hastily retrained as infantrymen from supply and support units were thrown into battles such as those in the Hürtgen forest, and they failed. Why? Well, you simply can't train a former supply soldier, driver, or administrative corporal to be a proper infantryman in just a few weeks, as the Bundeswehr seems to believe it can do with the homeland defenders. So, when these theoretical new infantrymen had to go into battle against real soldiers in 1944, there hadn't been enough time to get tips and advice from the experienced frontline soldiers. As a result, many newcomers were killed or wounded within the first few days. Under these conditions, especially due to the lack of cohesion in the heterogeneous units, morale and discipline steadily declined, and unauthorized absences from their units and so-called self-mutilations also increased rapidly in the last 8 months of the war. In contrast, the old, battle-hardened soldiers, the frontline grunts, were used up in action until they were killed, wounded, incapacitated by illness, or simply couldn't go on anymore. A U.S. historian summed up the conclusion about this method of rapid-fire training of soldiers from other branches into infantrymen as follows. If the Germans had been given the opportunity to design a replacement system for us that would cause us the greatest possible harm while providing the least possible benefit, they couldn't have done it any better. With this example as well, I would like to urge those responsible in the Bundeswehr not to make the same mistakes as the U.S. Army did. Quick training to become infantrymen, because, after all, the Bundeswehr's home defense troops are nothing other than infantrymen. Quickly trained, poorly equipped infantrymen who are too few in number and have to guard facilities around the clock, would have to defend them, but would stand no chance against a serious and ruthless enemy in combat. I will leave it at that regarding this assessment of the supposed war readiness of the Bundeswehr. I was not trying to spare any responsible politician or general who would not be found on the proverbial front line anyway, but rather the soldiers who are at the mercy of these people for better or worse, as it was for my generation during the Cold War. In any case, General Marshall proved that, with the backing of high-level politics, it is possible to turn a sluggish peacetime army with outdated, entrenched structures into a powerful fighting force. Although I am already certain that, thanks to politics, this will not happen with the current Bundeswehr. As for the architect of the Allied victory, Marshall, who was promoted to 5-star general in 1944, he also had to experience after the war how short the span can be from Hosanna to crucify him. In 1947, he was in Berlin, brought out of retirement and made Secretary of State. But the efforts of the war, the Bundeswehr, which Marshall in 1949, his successor, served, have described the Bundeswehr as a kind of 4-engine bomber that flies with only one engine. Marshall resigned in January 1949, but in 1950 he was called back into government service, this time as Secretary of Defense, although he was still in poor health. And after being suspected and vilified by Senator Joseph McCarthy during his anti-communist campaign as a traitor and an accomplice of the communists on their way to world domination, he finally withdrew from politics in September 1951. Certainly, Marshall neither wanted nor approved of the oppression of the countries occupied by the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin in 1945, and he was certainly not responsible for it. because those were the decisions of the U.S. presidents. Franklin D. Roosevelt, partly his successor Harry S. Truman, and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill.